When I plan a new garden bed, I actually don't do a lot of planning. I plan the pathways and the size of the bed, and then quite honestly, I go out and get a bunch of plants and just start putting them in. I've tried using a more conventional approach where I draw it all out and put little circles and figure out which plant goes where and figure out which ones go together. That's never really worked for me. Now, if I was working only with plants I knew, the ones I've grown for a long time, like these daffodils, for instance, I know how big they are, I know how fast they spread. I also know when it's going to flower. So I know a lot about that plant, and I could figure out, will it look good beside this other plant that I know really well? But a lot of the things I plant are new plants to me, and I think that's true of most of you too. You're not plant experts. This isn't your business. This is a hobby. So you go out, you get yourself a new plant. The tag says it's 3 feet tall, but that depends a lot on climate. So maybe it's 3 feet tall in Ontario, but it gets 6 feet tall in Texas. Or maybe it's the other way around. Some of the plants remain in nice clumps. Others spread quite quickly, so they need more space. There are so many unknowns, and so I just prefer to plant stuff, and then I evaluate it and figure out where should I move it next. If something works, I leave it. If I don't like something, I move it, or I throw it out. Now that method works really well for me and it keeps the garden interesting, but if I don't pay attention to a garden for a while, it gets kind of old. Things start overgrowing, things are in there that maybe I don't really like, and that's the case with this garden behind me here. This is a bed I've sort of ignored for a couple years now, and it's getting really tired. And what I'd like to do in this video and the next one is spend time and redo this bed. So what I'm going to do in this video is analyze it. I'm going to take you around the bed, show you things, give you my personal view on various plants, positioning, the overall design, and that will lay the foundation for a remediation project, which I'll probably do next week. And I'll make a separate video on that. So this video is all about remediating this bed, but it's the why. The next video will be the how, and I'll actually show you how to do it. When I'm analyzing a bed like this, I don't start with the plants. I know as gardeners, we're so focused on the plants, and particularly when they're flowering, right, they attract us and we want to talk plants. But when we're looking at design, it's really important to ignore the plants and look at the hardscape, look at the pathways and the edging. So the first thing I want to ask myself is, do I want to make any changes to the shape of the bed? This is a round bed and it has pathways going all the way around it. Now this pathway over here is quite wide and I can run my lawnmower up here. That makes it easy for moving things around, but it gives me a wide pathway that I have to keep clean and weed. The pathways on the other side of this bed are quite narrow and they're too small for my lawnmower. Now I'd originally thought of widening this side of it, but I think I've decided not to do that. Widening does mean it's easier to carry things to that side of the garden because I can use the lawnmower and a cart I have. But widening also means I have more maintenance on the pathway and I don't really want that. One thing to understand about this bed is that it slopes down on the back side. So to make that pathway wider, I'd have to build up quite a high wall. It's going to take a lot of rock and a lot of work, and I just don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave the pathways where they are, which means the shape of the bed won't change. The next thing I focus on are the bigger plants. Now this is a weeping white pine, and it's a really beautiful plant. You can see it's not very tall, even though it's been in this garden for about 15 years. That's a big advantage of weepers. They don't really get very tall, and by pruning I can keep it pretty much any size I want. Now, it's a large enough plant that it would be very difficult to move it. So I'm either going to keep it and I'm stuck with it in this location, or I'm going to get rid of it. And since it's such a beautiful plant, it's going to stay. That's an easy decision here. But one thing I noticed is some of the branches are hanging down too low. You can see this one in front here is laying on the ground. So I do have to prune a little bit and limb this up. And this also lets a little more light into the plants down here. So a little maintenance on this guy, but it stays. Here's another woody plant. It's a burning bush. So the first problem I have is that this is planted way too close to this one. Again, these were planted 12 years ago, and at that time they were far enough apart, but this has grown really well. This one, on the other hand, really hasn't. And the big problem with this one is that rabbits really like it. So it gets chewed to the ground every winter. So now I have to decide what to do with it. I don't want to leave it here because it's too close. So I could dig it out and move it somewhere else. But it really hasn't done very well, except in the last couple years it's done a little better because now it's grown to this height and it seems to be above where the rabbits go. It's also a big shrub now. It's going to be difficult to dig out. I'm leaning towards getting rid of it completely. Now I think what I'll do is I'll dig it up and I'll see what the root system's like. If I can get a good plant out with a good root system, I just may plant it somewhere out back in the shrub garden. What I would do then is prune it to a single stem, put some wire around it to keep the rabbits away, and then grow this upper part. But I'm going to guess that by the time I dig this out, I'm going to do a lot of damage to the roots, and it's not going to be worth saving. This little guy is a ginkgo. It's just starting to leaf out, and it's a beautiful little shrub. It's a slower growing ginkgo. The cultivar name is American, starting with an M. You can tell how fast these grow by looking at last year's growth. And this stem here is about 5 inches, I would say. So we can expect it to add 5 inches a year. So in 5 years from now, 25 inches. It'll be out about like this. Now if it gets that big, it's going to be encroaching on the pathway here. So there are a couple of options. I could move it, or I just reserve myself to the idea that I'm going to keep it pruned to be a little smaller. Make it grow up and that way and not in the pathway. And I think that's what I'm going to do. I don't really want to move it. It's a good location here. People come through the archway and see it right away, so I'd rather leave it. But it is a really choice ginkgo if you can get it. The other thing to consider are the other large things in the garden. Here I have a big rock, and it was put here with an excavator, so I'm not moving this. This stays, and I have to design around it. So we've now had a look at the woody material in this bed and decided what we're going to do with it. And I think that's the place to start. Those things are more permanent than perennials, and they tend to be larger, so we have to sort those out. And then you worry about the other plantings to go around them. So let's have a look at some of these perennials. In the center of the picture, we have a euphorbia called polychroma. And this is a really nice plant. It's going to open up its flowers soon. And the nice thing about this plant is it seems to be in flower for a very long time. Now the flowers only last a couple weeks, but the bracts on this plant are good for 2 months. Later on in summer, it's a plant that's about 2 to 3 feet tall, so it's quite a nice plant. You'll notice that around it are a lot of muscaris. Now, I love muscaris, but the one problem with them is that they self-seed quite a bit, and that can be a problem. If your garden is full of shorter plants, then the muscari are a real problem because they're large relative to those shorter plants. And over here in my rock garden, I try to keep most things under 6 inches tall, and the muscari take over a lot of the smaller plants. So in the rock garden, I've decided to get rid of all these, and it's taken about 2 or 3 years now of pulling these out. So what I do is I wait until they flower so I know which muscari I'm pulling, because I do grow about 10 different varieties. And once the flowers are finished and the seeds are starting to develop, the bulb that's underneath also loses some of its roots, and they're a lot easier to pull out. But I go through the garden, and every year I pull out anything that's flowering and get rid of it. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do in this bed. I am going to have taller plants. I don't want more rock garden areas. So these muscaris could stay. I just have to pick plants that are large enough to put up with them. So that's a design decision I should make now. The alternative is to start taking them out of this bed. One plant I really like are the allium. They're ornamental onions. And when I first built this garden, I found this nice red one, which is actually very popular. And I put it in the garden in a few spots, and it did really well. And then I started seeing all the seedlings. This plant just makes too many babies, and then they start spreading around, and that's what you're looking at here. At the back of the picture here, those are all allium seedlings. The only way to get rid of these is to dig them up, and I'm in the process of removing all of this particular type of allium from the garden. To the left, we have a nice clump of chrysanthemums, and we want to preserve that. Straight ahead, there's an ornamental clover. I want to keep that one. And we have a penstemon to the right. These are all desirable plants, and so it's important to go through the garden and identify the good plants, mark them if you have to, and then start weeding out everything else. Well, here are some interesting little purple flowers. Now, I know lots of you like to grow natives, but this idea that all natives are good plants is completely wrong. These are some native violets, and about 8 years ago I put a couple into this bed, and then I noticed they're spreading like crazy, and they spread by seeds. And I've been trying to dig these out for about 8 years now. Native plants are great in the right spot, and you put these guys into a shady area, they're okay. But here in full sun, they just take over, and it's impossible to get rid of them. I found another clump of these not far from here that are starting to get into my native woods. If you don't stay on top of these guys and weed them out on a regular basis and keep them from flowering, you will have them everywhere. This is a daffodil called Thalia, and it's a really nice white one. In fact, I have several clumps of really nice daffodils in this garden. They present a unique problem when you're redoing a bed. It's spring now, and I can move most of the perennials quite easily. But what about these daffodils, and in fact any spring bulbs? You really can't move them at this time of the year. So I have two options here. I can leave the clumps where they are and work around them. At least this time of the year I know where the clumps are, and that's fairly easy to do. The other option is to mark the clumps and then wait until the leaves start dying back. Once the leaves go yellow, I can dig up the clump. Either of those options work quite well. And once I've removed most of the junk in this garden, I'll have another look at these clumps and see if I like them where they are. This particular clump is situated quite nice. It is sitting very close to this yellow variety, but I think that's okay. They work well together. This is a clump of a special monkshood. It stays quite short, maybe 2 feet tall. That's short for monkshoods, and is a yellow color. Around here, the plant is sold as the cultivar named Ivorine, but I now have the true Ivorine, and it's a little different than this one, so we're not quite sure what the cultivar of this is. And down towards the bottom of the picture, there are 2 or 3 clumps of this. I'll keep one clump, probably the big mother clump. I'll dig up the babies and pot them up, and they'll be available for some friends. This is a highly desirable plant, so I will save the babies. If you have a chance to grow some of the unusual monkshood, give that a try. There are lots of different species and some really neat cultivars. Some bloom midsummer, some bloom later in the season. Some are 4 or 5 feet tall, and then some are really short. I found all of the monkshood good plants to grow, but they are a bit hard to grow from seed. Earlier in this video, I talked about an allium that spreads too much, and I'm getting rid of it. But most alliums are really nice garden plants, and here's a really special one. Stays quite short, but what's unique about this plant is that it's the last flowering perennial in my garden, and it will flower in October in my Zone 5 garden. Because it flowers so late, it never makes seeds. I have to wait until the clump gets bigger and makes offsets, and then I can divide it. I now have 2 or 3 clumps in the garden. I've given a few clumps away. So this is a really special plant, and I'll definitely protect it. Sounds like I have some competition. I can hear the tree frogs croaking, and I'm sure you can hear the birds. But that's just good background music. Here's one of my special muscaris. I believe it's called Mount Hood. It's a very slow growing plant, It really doesn't seed itself very much, but I do have to be careful because the blue muscari, which seeds a lot, will seed itself inside this clump and then mix the two cultivars together. So around this area, I have to make sure I remove all the blue muscari to keep this cultivar pure. It is a really nice plant, it's just very slow growing. So I guess if you want a muscari in your garden and you don't want it to spread, this is a good choice. These are some dried stems from a Russian sage, and it's been in here a number of years and it just doesn't do well in this spot. I don't know if it's the cultivar or the location. It is a bit shadier here because of the weeping white pine, so it may be the shade. Now I have Russian sage in a number of other areas in the garden where it does really well, and it is a plant I like, but for some reason it's just not growing well here. So I really have two options. One is to dig it up and to move it, and the other is to get rid of it. And since I have it in other spots, I don't really need any more, I'm just going to get rid of it. Here's another very special monkshood. It stays quite short and blooms at about 2 feet tall. This plant has only been in the garden for a couple years, but it's starting to do really well. And we got to make sure we don't damage this plant. This is the remains of a really nice grass, and it's a warm grower, so it hasn't really started to do anything. I cut it back, and these are the old brown stubbles, and it's just starting to make some green tips here and there. But the clump has been there for quite a while, and you can tell that by the size of the clump and by the fact that the center of the clump is starting to get hollow. And that's common in grasses. That's just the way they grow. Now they normally would make a ring of new grass, but there's a big plant right behind it that shades the back part of it, so it's only growing on the front sunny side. There are two options here. We can just leave it. The grass is fine the way it is. But this clump is getting kind of old, and it's probably a good idea to dig it up, split it, and start a new clump. And I think that's what we'll do in this bed. This grass is also self-seeded over here, and we really should take this one out and plant it somewhere else. Now we've had a look at some of the perennials in this garden, and we had a discussion about which ones we'll keep and which one we won't keep. There is one other decision I have to make. There are some areas of this garden that have very low growing plants. This one in front of me is one of them. This in fact is a really nice dianthus. Even though it had a hard time this winter, I think the deer came in and chewed a lot of it off, but it will come back. And then I have the low muscari in here and some other alpine plants. I have to decide whether I'm going to keep the low plants or go with higher plants. Now you can have a mixture, so you can have this area low and then over here taller ones. But it is of value to decide where the low plants go, where the mid-sized plants go, and where the tall ones go. You also want to give some thought to having taller plants in the center. So I have a couple of very large perennials in the center that will be 3-4 feet tall, and then I tend to have smaller ones near the edge. Now, smaller is relative. So here's a daffodil that is 1.5 feet tall. Well, that is shorter than the one over there. And then here they're even shorter. So I tend to plant short in the front, tall in the back, but I don't follow that religiously. I find the bed works much better if you mix that up a bit. So I still have to give a little bit of thought as to how tall the plants will be in this garden. Anyways, that's it for this video. That's my planning process. Now I actually have to go and do the work. And I'm going to make a separate video in about a week to show you how to do that.